The history of the Constitution of the Roman Republic is a study of the ancient Roman Republic that traces the progression of Roman political development from the founding of the Roman Republic in 509 BC until the founding of the Roman Empire in 27 BC. The constitutional history of the Roman Republic can be divided into 5 phases. The first phase began with the revolution which overthrew the Roman kingdom in 510 BC, and the final phase ended with the revolution which overthrew the Roman Republic, and thus created the Roman Empire, in 27 BC. Throughout the history of the Republic, the constitutional evolution was driven by the struggle between the aristocracy and the ordinary citizens. The Roman aristocracy was composed of a class of citizens called patricians, while all other citizens were called plebeians. During the first phase of political development, the patrician aristocracy dominated the state, and the plebeians began seeking political rights. During the second phase, the plebeians completely overthrew the patrician aristocracy, and since the aristocracy was overthrown simply through alterations to the Roman law, this revolution was not violent. The third phase saw the emergence of a joint patricio-plebeian aristocracy, along with a dangerous military situation that helped to maintain internal stability within the Republic. The fourth phase began shortly after Rome's wars of expansion had ended, because without these wars, the factor that had ensured internal stability was removed. While the plebeians sought to address their economic misfortune through the enactment of laws, the underlying problems were ultimately caused by the organization of society. The final phase began when Julius Caesar crossed the Rubicon River, and ended with the complete overthrow of the Republic. This final revolution triggered a wholesale reorganization of the constitution, and with it, the emergence of the Roman Empire. The patrician era. According to legend, the Roman kingdom was founded in 753 BC, and was ruled by a succession of 7 kings. The last king, Lucius Tarquinius Superbus, ruled in a tyrannical manner, and, in 510 BC, his son, Sextus Tarquinius, raped a noblewoman named Lucretia. Lucretia, the wife of a senator named Lucius Tarquinius Collatinus, committed suicide because of the rape, and this led to a conspiracy which drove Tarquin from the city. With Tarquin's expulsion, the Roman Republic was founded, and the chief conspirators, Collatinus and the senator Lucius Junius Brutus, were elected as the first Roman consul. While this story may be nothing more than a legend which later Romans created in order to explain the past, it is likely that Rome had been ruled by a series of kings, who probably were, as the legends suggest, overthrown quickly. The executive magistrates. The constitutional changes which occurred immediately after the revolution were probably not as extensive as the legends suggest, as the most important constitutional change probably concerned the chief executive. Before the revolution, a king was elected by the senators for a life term, but now 2 praetors were elected by the citizens for an annual term. These magistrates were eventually called consuls, and each consul checked his colleague, while their limited term in office opened them up to prosecution if they abused the powers of their office. The chief executive was still vested with the same grade of imperium powers as was the old king, and the powers of each of the 2 consuls, when exercised together, were no different than were those of the old king. During the years of the monarchy, only patricians were admitted to the Roman Senate. The revolution of 510 BC so depleted the ranks of the Senate, however, that a group of plebeians were drafted to fill the vacancies. The old Senate of patricians transitioned into a Senate of patres et conscripta. These new plebeian senators, however, could neither vote on an auctoritas patrum, nor be elected inter rex. In the year 494 BC, the city was at war, but the plebeian soldiers refused to march against the enemy, and instead seceded to the Aventine Hill. The patricians quickly became desperate to end what was, in effect, a labor strike, and thus they quickly agreed to the demands of the plebeians, that they be given the right to elect their own officials. The plebeians named these new officials plebeian tribunes, and gave them two assistants, the plebeian aedile. During the early years of the Republic, the plebeians were not allowed to hold ordinary political office. In 445 BC, the plebeians demanded the right to stand for election to the consulship, but the Senate refused to grant them this right. After a long resistance to the new demands, the Senate sent a commission of 3 patricians to Greece to study and report on the legislation of Solon and other lawmakers. When they returned, the assembly chose 10 men decemviri formulate a new code, and gave them supreme governmental power in Rome for 2 years. This commission, under the presidency of a resolute reactionary, Appius Claudius, transformed the old customary law of Rome into the famous 12 tables, submitted them to the assembly, and displayed them in the forum for all who would and could to read. The 12 tables recognized certain rights and gave the plebs their own representatives, the tribunes. However, the consulship remained closed to the plebeians. Consular command authority was granted to a select number of military tribunes. These individuals, the so-called consular tribunes, were elected by the Century Assembly, and the Senate had the power to veto any such election. This was the first of many attempts by the plebeians to achieve political equality with the patricians. Starting around the year 400 BC, a series of wars were fought, and while the patrician aristocracy enjoyed the fruits of the resulting conquests, the plebeians in the army became exhausted and bitter. They demanded real concessions, and so in 367 BC a law was passed which dealt with the economic plight of the plebeians. However, the law also required the election of at least one plebeian consul each year. The opening of the consulship to the plebeians was probably the cause behind the concession of 366 BC, in which the praetorship and curular aedileship were both created, but opened only to patricians. The Senate and legislative assemblies shortly after the founding of the Republic. The Century Assembly became the principal Roman assembly in which magistrates were elected, laws were passed, and trials occurred. During his consulship in 5009 BC, Publius Valerius Publicola enacted a law which guaranteed due process rights to every Roman citizen. Any condemned citizen could evoke his right of provocatia, which appealed any condemnation to the Century Assembly, and which was a precursor to habeas corpus. Also around this time, the plebeians assembled into an informal plebeian curiate assembly, which was the original plebeian council. Since they were organized on the basis of the curia, they remained dependent on their patrician patrons. In 471 BC, a law was passed due to the efforts of the tribune Valero Publilius, which allowed the plebeians to organize by tribe, rather than by curia. Thus, the plebeian curiate assembly became the plebeian tribal assembly, and the plebeians became politically independent. During the regal period, the king nominated 2 quaestors to serve as his assistants, and after the overthrow of the monarchy, the consuls retained this authority. However, in 447 BC, Cicero recorded that the quaestors began to be elected by a tribal assembly that was presided over by a magistrate. It seems as though this was the first instance of a joint patricio-plebeian tribal assembly, and thus was probably an enormous gain for the plebeians. While patricians were able to vote in a joint assembly, there were never very many patricians in Rome. Thus, most of the electors were plebeians, and yet any magistrate elected by a joint assembly had jurisdiction over both plebeians and patricians. Therefore, for the first time, the plebeians seem to have indirectly acquired authority over patricians. During the 4th century BC, a series of reforms were passed, which ultimately required that any law passed by the plebeian council have the full force of law over both plebeians and patricians. This gave the plebeian tribunes, who presided over the plebeian council, a positive character for the first time. Before these laws were passed, tribunes could only interpose the sacrosanctity of their person to veto acts of the Senate, assemblies, or magistrates. It was a modification to the Valerian law in 449 BC which first allowed acts of the plebeian council to have the full force of law, but eventually the final law in the series was passed, which removed the last check that the patricians in the Senate had over this power. The conflict of the orders. In the decades following the passage of the Licinio-Sextian law of 367 BC, which required the election of at least one plebeian consul each year, a series of laws were passed which ultimately granted plebeians political equality with patricians. The patrician era came to a complete end in 287 BC, with the passage of the Hortensian law. This era was also marked with significant external developments. Up until 295 BC, the Samnites and the Celts had been Rome's chief rivals, but that year, at the Battle of Sentinum, the Romans defeated the combined armies of the Samnites and the Celts. This battle was followed by the complete submission of both the Samnites and the Celts to the Romans, and the emergence of Rome as the unchallenged mistress of Italy. The plebeians and the magistrates. When the curular aedileship had been created, it had only been open to patricians. Eventually, however, plebeians won full admission to the curular aedileship. In addition, after the consulship had been open to the plebeians acquired a de facto right to hold both the Roman dictatorship and the Roman censorship, since only former consuls could hold either office. 356 BC saw the appointment of the first plebeian dictator, and in 339 BC the plebeians facilitated the passage of a law, which required the election of at least one plebeian censor for each 5-year term. In 337 BC, the first plebeian praetor was elected. In 342 BC, 2 significant laws were passed. One of these 2 laws made it illegal to hold more than one office at any given point in time, and the other law required an interval of 10 years to pass before any magistrate could seek re-election to any office. As a result of these 2 laws, the military situation quickly became unmanageable. During this time period, Rome was expanding within Italy and beginning to take steps beyond Italy, and thus it became necessary for military commanders to hold office for several years at a time. This problem was resolved with the creation of the ProMagisterial Offices, so that when an individual's term in office ended, his command might be prorogued. In effect, when a magistrate's term ended, his imperium was extended, and he usually held the title of either proconsul or propraetor. This constitutional device was not in harmony with the underlying genius of the Roman constitution, and its frequent usage eventually paved the way for the empire. In addition, during these years, the plebeian tribunes and the senators grew increasingly close. The Senate realized the need to use plebeian officials to accomplish desired goals, and so to win over the tribunes. The senators gave the tribunes a great deal of power, and unsurprisingly, the tribunes began to feel obligated to the Senate. As the tribunes and the senators grew closer, plebeian senators were often able to secure the tribunate for members of their own families. In time, the tribunate became a stepping stone to higher office. The Ovinian law and the new aristocracy. During the era of the kingdom, the Roman king appointed new senators, but after the overthrow of the kingdom, the consuls acquired this power. Around the middle of the 4th century BC, however, the plebeian council enacted the Ovinian plebiscite, which gave the power to appoint new senators to the Roman censors. It also codified a commonplace practice which all but required the censor to appoint any newly elected magistrate to the Senate. By this point, plebeians were already holding a significant number of magisterial offices, and so the number of plebeian senators probably increased quickly. It was, in all likelihood, simply a matter of time before the plebeians came to dominate the Senate. Under the new system, newly elected magistrates were awarded with automatic membership in the Senate, although it remained difficult for a plebeian from an unknown family to enter the Senate. Several factors made it difficult for individuals from unknown families to be elected to high office. in particular the very presence of a long-standing nobility, as this appealed to the deeply rooted Roman respect for the past. Ultimately, a new patricio-plebeian aristocracy emerged, which replaced the old patrician nobility. It was the dominance of the long-standing patrician nobility which ultimately forced the plebeians to wage their long struggle for political power. The new nobility, however, was fundamentally different from the old nobility. The old nobility existed through the force of law, because only patricians were allowed to stand for high office, and it was ultimately overthrown after those laws were changed. Now, however, the new nobility existed due to the organization of society, and as such, it could only be overthrown through a revolution. The failure of the conflict of the orders. The conflict of the orders was finally coming to an end. Since the plebeians had achieved political equality with the patricians, a small number of plebeian families had achieved the same standing that the old aristocratic patrician families had always had. But these new plebeian aristocrats were as uninterested in the plight of the average plebeian as the old patrician aristocrats had always been. During this time period, the plebeian plight had been mitigated due to the constant state of war that Rome was in. These wars provided employment, income, and glory for the average plebeian, and the sense of patriotism that resulted from these wars also eliminated any real threat of plebeian unrest. The Lex Pub, which had required the election of at least one plebeian censor every 5 years, contained another provision. Before this time, any bill passed by an assembly could only become a law after the patrician senators gave their approval. This approval came in the form of an auctoritas patrum. The Lex Pub modified this process, requiring the auctoritas patrum to be passed before a law could be voted on by one of the assemblies, rather than after the law had already been voted on. It is not known why, but this modification seems to have made the auctoritas patrum irrelevant. By 287 BC, the economic condition of the average plebeian had become poor, and the result was the final plebeian secession. The plebeians seceded to the Janiculum Hill, and to end the secession, a dictator named Quintus Hortensius was appointed. Hortensius, a plebeian, passed a law called the Hortensian Law, which ended the requirement that an auctoritas patrum be passed before any bill could be considered by either the plebeian council or the tribal assembly. The requirement was not changed for the century assembly. The importance of the Hortensian law was in that it removed from the Senate its final check over the plebeian council. It should therefore not be viewed as the final triumph of democracy over aristocracy, since, through the tribunes, the Senate could still control the plebeian council. Thus, the ultimate significance of this law was in the fact that it robbed the patricians of their final weapon over the plebeians. The result was that the ultimate control over the state fell, not onto the shoulders of democracy, but onto the shoulders of the new patricio-plebeian aristocracy.